Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to go over the basics of infinitives with you. How do we recognize them? How do we form them? How do we translate them? You should already by now know one infinitive form by heart, and that is the present active infinitive, which can be found as the second principal part of any verb. So when you think of a verb like amo, amare, that amare is the infinitive that you've learned. Or, habeo, habere, right? That's the second principal part is the present active infinitive. Now, you often just refer to it as the infinitive, but in reality, it has a tense and it has a voice. It's the present active infinitive. But as you can see, there are actually six total infinitives in Latin. Okay, we have the present active, but then there's also a passive form of that same infinitive, the present passive infinitive, and then two more tenses of the infinitive, the perfect and the future, each of which have an active and a passive form. Now, for the most part, the infinitive that gets used the most is the present active infinitive. It's the one that most commonly shows up. Um, but the other forms do occur in more complicated uses of Latin grammar. So in this lesson, we're going to go over how are these formed and how are they translated. It's, for the most part, very, very straightforward in terms of their formation rules and their translation rules. Okay? And for the most part, out of all of these, five of the six are completely regular in the way that they are formed, meaning that there are no weird exceptions. There's no craziness. There's only one infinitive, which gets a little bit complicated. But even then, it's really not that bad. Okay, so let's begin with the present infinitives. The present active infinitive, as I just said, is the one that you already know. Okay, and the way it's translated is to verb. So to jump, to swim, to run, to whatever. Okay. And as far as formation goes, it's very easy to form and recognize because it's just the second principal part of the verb. So when you see this word, you've already kind of become good at recognizing these in sentences. Now, the present passive infinitive, okay, is just a passive version of the one that you've already learned. So when you translate, you add the standard word that we expect with the passive, which is be, being, or been. So if the present active infinitive that you already know is to verb, right? To run, to jump, to swim, to fight, whatever. Then the passive is going to be to be verb. Okay, so to be loved, to be fought, to be, whatever you want it to be. Okay, so all the rules that you've learned about how to make all these verb tenses, they're still going to generally hold true. If it's passive, it needs to have be, being, or been in there. Now, I mentioned that this is the most complicated of all the formation rules because there is a small little weirdness that occurs. But generally, the rule to create these is you take the present active infinitive, the one that's already given to you, okay, in the second principal part of the verb, and you just change, okay, the last E on there into a long I. So in the first conjugation, amare would become amari, or teneo tenere become teneri. Okay, or if you skip to the fourth conjugation, you see that a verb like venio venire becomes veniri. Okay, so generally you're just changing that last e to a long I. The exception to this is for the third and the third io, where instead the entire ere ending is dropped off and becomes an I by itself. Okay? It's a small change, and it's not really difficult to remember. These are very straightforward rules. Okay? The hard part comes with not accidentally doing the same thing for the second conjugation, for instance. And it often is the passive infinitives for the third conjugation and third io that are the hardest to recognize as infinitives because when you see them, they don't have that expected look to them. I'll show you some examples right now. So here are some of our infinitives that we know and love the present active infinitives: amare, habere, mittere, capere, and audire. Okay, so very easy. These are second principle parts, and you would know how to translate all of these guys: to love, to have, to send, to capture, to hear. Okay, now take a minute and try to figure out how would you create the different passive forms of these. Well, if you're going to do so, they would look a little something like this: amari, haberi, miti, capi, and audiri. Okay. Now you notice there's not a big change. Amare to amari, it's pretty easy to note that something weird is going on here. Okay. But mittere to miti and capere to capi, very easy to mistake those for like some noun form in the nominative, or if you think it's some kind of third declension word, maybe a dative. So these are the ones that are going to confuse you when you see them written down in Latin. Okay. The other ones are pretty easy to spot. Now, how would you translate them? Well, if amare is to love, then, or sorry, let's back up for a second. For all of these, remember, if you're going to make them passive, you just have to add the phrase be, being, or been to whatever words you're saying for the active forms. So amare means to love, then amari would end up being something like to be loved. Okay. You would try to say to be love, but then that's not going to make any sense, right? Or habere, which is to have or to hold. So haberi, to be, have, nah, to be held, to be holded. Not really a word. Mittere is going to become from to send to be sent. And then capere, to capture, is going to turn into copy, to be captured. Notice for all of these, oh, let's do the last one: audire, to hear, and then audiri, to be heard. Notice that for all of these, right, it looks like a past tense version of the English word, right? To be verbed, past tense. So to be loved, to be held, to be sent, right? On its own, loved, held, sent, caught, and heard are past tense. But in reality, when you're saying to be loved, that is a present tense action, right? That's happening in the current time. Or to be held is happening in a current present tense. So don't get confused because you see the loved, held, these past tense sounding words. Okay. This is a present active translation of this. So start with to love, add just so that's the present infinitive, add be, being, or been in there, and you'll automatically, as a native English speaker, kind of trick yourself into figuring out what the second part of that should be. All right. So that's the end of the present. From here on out, all of the other infinitives all use the same rule with no exceptions, no changes, no alterations. Um, so the next one we need to learn is the perfect infinitive, which has, like the present, an active and a passive form. The perfect active infinitive gets translated as an infinitive, so it has to have the word to, right? It's perfect, right? So it has to have that have or has in there. And then you just fill in the rest with the verb. So to have verbed, okay? The way it's formed is you take the perfect stem, which is the third principal part, which is where everything that's perfect active comes from, okay? So perfect active, if you were just making the perfect active tense, you would use that same stem. And that stem comes from the third principal part minus I. And then you add isse onto it. That's it. End of story. No changes, no weirdness. That's it. The perfect passive infinitive, okay? So again, go step by step. It's an infinitive. So you say to, perfect. So it has have, passive. So it has to have be, being, or been. And then you can fill in the rest yourself. So to have been blanked. Okay. This, just like the perfect passive form that you learned in the indicative, is the same pattern. Fourth principal part plus a verb to be. And in this case, because it's an infinitive, you're going to use the infinitive of the verb to be, which is esse. So it's always going to be esse here. Now, small word of warning, this uses the fourth principal part. And you'll remember that the fourth principal part is that part of the verb that you always have to make sure is agreeing with the subject in gender and number, and theoretically case as well. So, you know how if you say, he has been loved in the indicative, you would have to say like amatus est. But then if you want to say she has been loved, it would be amata est. You have to check the gender number case. Same thing goes for this infinitive. Okay? It's not going to require a lot of craziness, a lot of crazy changes, but it is something you have to keep in mind. But that's it. If you can memorize these rules, then that is it. It's that simple. And a lot of it is kind of self-explanatory, and it kind of just makes sense. Here's some practice again for you. Okay, so first off, the perfect active infinitive. These are the same verbs that we looked at before. So to love, to hold, to send, to capture, and to listen. But instead, I have given you the third principal part. So for each of these, you would have to figure out how to make the stem, which would be by cutting off the I's, okay? And then you're going to create the infinitive using the rules from the previous slide, which is basically just adding isse onto them. So you're going to end up with amawisse, habuwisse, misisse, kepisse, and audiwisse. They're very recognizable. There's nothing else in Latin that uses this ending here. So these are usually very, very easy to spot. They're very easy to tell. You're dealing with perfect active infinitives. And the translation of all of them, remember, they are infinitives, they are active, so you're not going to use be, being, been, and they're going to have to include have or has in here. So this becomes to have loved, right? And here's the perfect with have or has. To have held, to have sent, to have caught, and to have heard. And that's it. It's a very simple pattern, no craziness. Here we have the perfect passives, okay? And again, these guys are built off of the fourth principal part, okay? Amatus, habitus, missus, captus, auditus. And the pattern for all of these is going to be fourth principal part plus an infinitive of the verb to be, in which case we have amatus, habitus, missus, captus, auditus. Translation, perfect and passive, and it's an infinitive. So infinitive means to, have, been, and then whatever your word meaning is. So to have been loved, to have been held, to have been sent, to have been caught, to have been heard. Pretty straightforward. Before we move on from this, I do want to make one thing known, is that typically infinitives are generally always considered neuter. And so it would be very rare for you to have an us ending on one of these. Usually you're going to have an ending on here. But for reasons that we'll talk about later, it's not always going to be So I didn't put on here because I thought this would be a little bit easier for you to see the connection here. But we will see examples soon enough where you're not going to use this us at all. All right, the last two infinitives that you need to know, the future infinitives, the active and the passive. Okay. The active is really the only one that you're going to actually see anywhere. And its formation is fairly straightforward, like all of these are. It's the fourth principal part, but instead of ending in us, it ends in urus, ura, urum. Okay? And then you just add the infinitive esse. So this is a two-word form, just like the perfect passive was, except here you have orus, ora, orum, esse. So really the only difference between the future active and the perfect passive is an extra syllable, or, that gets added in between there. Translation-wise, it's going to have the word to because it's an infinitive. And then I recommend using this acronym to help give you some understanding of what you can say, because there's a lot of options here. You can say to be going to verb, to be intending to verb, to be likely to verb, to be destined to verb, to be about to verb. Right? So to be going to jump, to be intending to jump. It might sound silly, but we don't use future active infinitives in English very much, so you kind of have to come up with these roundabout ways of expressing what's going on here. The future passive infinitive is extremely rare. In fact, it's so rare that Trautmann doesn't even include it in the textbook in this particular chapter. Um, it's extremely rare, and it's so rare the Romans actually tried to avoid it at all costs. If they ever found themselves accidentally writing a sentence where they would have to use the future passive infinitive, they would change the sentence and replace that infinitive with something called the fore ut construction, which we don't really have to worry about. For the purposes of complete, information, the way that the future passive infinitive is created is by taking the fourth principal part. It has to end in and then you follow it up with the word eerie. Um, uh, and that's it. It ends there. There's no other weirdness or changes. Um, but for practical purposes, do not worry about this. You do not have to really consider this too much because it does not really ever show up. If I need you to know it, I will let you know. But I would say ignore this for now. It shows up so rarely in Latin. And when it does, the Romans would try to avoid it even then. But it's good to note that, again, like the perfect passive infinitive, this guy does need to be declined because, look, it has the us, a, ending on it. So you're going to have to decline this guy, just like everything else made from the fourth principal part. Whereas this guy, because it always ends in you're not going to have to worry about that. But theoretically, practically, which I guess are opposites, practically, you don't need to worry about this at all. But you should worry about that for this one. So here's some practice again. Our friends, same friends as before. For all of these, we're going to use the same pattern. We're going to cut off the us and add orus a So plus the verb esse. Right? So amatorum esse, habitorum esse, misorum esse, autorum esse, nauditorum esse. And for all of these, you want to use the acronym GILDA. Going to, intending to, likely to, destined to, about to. So to, be, going to, about to, whatever you want. You can choose whichever you like. I used about to here, but you can see it's pretty straightforward. I've included the future passive here. You can see it has to use for all of these. For the future active, all of these could be other things. They could be usses, asses, oses. They could be all different things. But for this one, it has to be And then for all of them, to be about to be loved. Passive, so be, being, been. But again, this is extremely rare. I would not waste too much time being concerned about this guy. So that completes understanding how these things are formed. It is important to remember that there are deponent verbs. And so if you've ever been wondering why deponent verbs look the way they do, why when you look up a deponent verb, you would get a second principal part that ends in an I, for instance, well, that's because that's the typical passive infinitive ending. So you already know how to form these passive infinitives. This infinitive is formed the same way. So it looks passive and is translated as actively. So instead of this being to have been urged, it just means to have urged, active meaning. The one weird thing is, though, that instead of a future passive form, the Romans said, we hate the future passive so much, right? We hate this guy so much, this amatum iri guy. We hate him so much that we're going to undeponent deponent verbs and make them active in form and in meaning in the future infinitive, which is just bonkers. They just hated this form so much that they decided to undeponent deponent verbs to make them sound better. Crazy. But it kind of makes sense. If you understand how badly the Romans hated this form, you would see why they would want to swap to this one. So the nice thing is, though, this is sort of like this is taking the broken weirdness and fixing it. So you probably wouldn't even notice that this was something that was changed. You would automatically associate this orus esse form with future active infinitive. So here's a quick breakdown. Here are the various endings. If you basically can remember this chart, You can basically do most of this on your own or without having any issue. Although for some reason this is fourth principal part instead of second principal part. So I guess you shouldn't memorize this particular chart. You should memorize this chart, but without this. But also don't forget that I have a special handout for you that you can look at for a better chart than this. So this is just a quick, all the endings in one place. But I will have other aids for you that will be more helpful sort of study guides. And that's it.